and you're recording.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Alan Power. I'm a geriatrician from Rochester, New York, and the author of the books Dementia Beyond Drugs and Dementia Beyond Disease. And I'm pleased to be working with Dementia Inclusive Durham in this educational event for you. Just to acknowledge once again, this project is supported in part by a grant from the U.S. Administration for Community Living, Department of Health and Human Services. And so please thank them for us. We really are very grateful for their support. Just to recap, you have had an introduction, a talk that talked about understanding dementia, learning about what it is, the different causes of dementia, different symptoms, different risk factors, etc., and a bit of a section at the end about how we can expand our mindset in learning how best to support people living with a diagnosis. And in that section, a well-being framework was introduced with 7 what they call domains of well-being. And what I'd like to do for the next 4 sessions is to expand upon that, because I found that this well-being framework is very useful in helping us to better understand how to support people living with dementia, how to understand them better, and sometimes to give us new insights into what is going on when people become distressed. Today, we're going to talk about the first 2 of those 7 domains of well-being, and that is the domains of identity and connectedness. We'll be covering 2 more next time, the final 3 in part 4, and in part 5, we'll wrap it up by showing how this approach can be used to understand and support people who may become distressed from time to time. So let's launch into identity. Just a reminder that we can put these in sort of a pyramid, that I believe that identity and connectedness are really foundational to supporting people and restoring their well-being, because it's very hard to bring well-being to a stranger. It's very important to know people well and to have an important relationship with them in order to understand how they can achieve well-being on several of the other planes. And so that's why I chose to speak about these 2 domains first of all. So what is identity? Identity is a lot of different things for any of us. It's a combination of who we are, who we have been throughout our lives. It may be associated with an occupation. I may have an identity as a physician, but it may also be associated with hobbies or interests you have. So you may be a gardener. You may be someone who sings in your church choir. You may have other social roles that become part of your identity. Also, our personality is part of our identity, the way we express ourselves, the way we view the world, and the way we cope with different events and stresses in our lives. Identity is also what our personal strengths are, what some of our challenges may be as well. And it also involves things we like, things we don't like, and very much so our individual rhythms. Each of us goes through the day, has different rhythms of energy, of waking, of sleeping, of activity and rest. And this is a very important part of who we are as well. But it's also important to remember that identity also evolves over time. So some things over time may change for us, but some do not. And when you live with a condition like dementia, it's possible that some parts may change over time based on your interests, your abilities, your likes and dislikes, but there are some parts of you that may remain very durable. And it's important to know what is still very much who you are and what are some of the things that may be open to change over time. I find that there's a wonderful way to look at this that was quoted by Sam Fazio from the Alzheimer's Association. He wrote a book called The Enduring Self in People with Alzheimer's. And he talks about this tricky interplay for people's identity with the past, the present, and the future. It's a little bit tricky, but I'll read it to you and see if you can understand the gist of what this is. Sam said, "It is important to connect with who the person is currently, to support who the person has been throughout his or her life, and to stay open to exploring who he or she is becoming. The past must be allowed to influence the present, yet not to define it. The present must also be allowed to influence the present. At the same time, both the past and present must be allowed to shape the future, and the future must be left free to influence itself." So what he's saying is who we have been is very much a part of us, and it may help determine who we are today, but also events that are evolving around with us and within us at the present can also shift our identity. And that has to be somewhat left open so we can evolve into the person who we are going to become. So some things, for instance, may remain very stable. If a person, for example, is frightened of dogs when they are young because of a traumatic experience, then there's a good chance that when they're living with the dementia, even advanced dementia, they may still have that frightened reaction if they come into contact with a dog. Other things, however, may change. Our preferences for food, our preferences for certain types of activities may change, partly because we don't feel like doing them anymore, partly because maybe with the change in our cognition, we're not able to do them the same way anymore. So that may mean changing activities so that they're more accessible to us, or it may simply mean getting rid of that and finding something else that interests us today. There are many challenges to our identity when you have a diagnosis of dementia. Some of them are due to the brain disease itself, but others may be due to our interaction with society or society's response to our diagnosis. So memory loss, of course, is an important challenge to identity because being able to remember our history, remembering what our jobs have been, who our important relationships are, what our important achievements have been, is very much part of our identity. And when we have trouble pulling up those memories, it becomes much harder to maintain those feelings of who you are. The loss of a job due to aging or due to dementia, the loss of social roles due to your inability to maintain them also challenges your identity. If my identity is as a doctor, but I can no longer be a doctor because I'm challenged by a medical or a cognitive condition, then that, of course, challenges my self-image of who I am, of what I've accomplished. But there are other things that society does too, and over-medicalizing the experience of people with dementia also challenges our identity. There are a few things that the medical profession can do to challenge people's identity. One is to homogenize people and say if you have dementia, that you're kind of all alike. Now, we know that there are many, many different causes of dementia. We know that everybody is a unique individual regardless of his or her diagnosis. But when we talk about dementia care, when we talk about memory care or dementia housing, we're really putting people in a group and saying, really, in a way, they're all the same. They need the same approach to care. They need the same place to live. And that really denies us our special individuality. When we focus on stages and stereotypes, you are stage 3, therefore you will act like this, or you will be able to do this, you won't be able to do this. We're missing a variety of nuances, a variety of things that people can continue to do, or people may change in very unique ways, but we don't see that. When we stereotype people and say, if you have this kind of dementia, this is what you're going to experience. Once again, we do not see the individual. We do not recognize people's identity. So these are very important things to challenge when we talk about how we support people with dementia. Similarly, if all we see are what's wrong with people, what's missing, what their deficits are, then once again, it's a very narrow view of people. It doesn't help us to expect more of people. It doesn't help us to engage people in ways that might be meaningful to them because we expect less. And we'll talk a bit more about that shortly. As a result of these challenges to identity, our society tends to marginalize people and exclude them because of our fears, because of our myths, because of our stereotypes of people with dementia. And there's a lot of stigma attached to having the label of dementia. Now, what is the stigma? Well, here are a couple of definitions that may help you. The first one says the stigma causes an individual to be mentally classified by others in an undesirable, rejected stereotype, rather than an accepted normal one. So the mental classification is occurring not in the brain of the person with dementia, but others around that person are saying that they are somehow less, they are somehow undesirable, they are not normal. We're seeing them differently and generally in a negative way. That's what stigma means. Now, Thornycroft, in his definition, says the stigma actually has 3 important elements. There are 3 parts of stigma. The first part is we have lack of knowledge. So we have ignorance of what dementia is all about, and that feeds into the stigmas. Secondly, it's our attitudes. If we have biases or prejudices toward people with dementia, that feeds into the stigma. And finally, we can actually activate those beliefs and that lack of knowledge by actively discriminating against people because of their label. And we've seen this with people with disabilities, and we certainly see this with people with cognitive disabilities like dementia. The biggest problem with stigma is it can lead us to what I will call self-fulfilling prophecies. And the way I would describe this is any time when we expect less of an individual or a group of people, we do not provide the attention or resources they need to improve. And so when they fail to improve, it just reinforces our belief that they weren't capable in the first place. We see a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies in society. We've seen them with gender. That's why there's so many STEM programs now, because there was this sort of gender bias belief that girls and women weren't as good at science and math and technology. We've seen race biases, believing that people of certain racial backgrounds were not as good at certain things as others. We have seen these self-fulfilling prophecies toward the old and toward the young. So we might say someone's too old to learn something, but we might also say someone's too young to be capable at doing a job. So we see these biases as well. And we see self-fulfilling prophecies with dementia. We'll say they have a disease, they can't do this, we can't expect them to learn this, to remember this, or to accomplish this task because they're incapable. And this is very dangerous because it shuts down people's possibilities long before they are unable to do things or to express things. And that can really, squelch people's opportunity to live fully and to live well. So what feeds into these stigmas and these self-fulfilling prophecies? Well, as we said, lack of education is part of it, but also the wrong education. So if we look at dementia with an overly narrow medical lens, if we only see disease and deficits, that can feed into these stigmas, as I talked about, with the homogenization, with the stage and stereotype view. But also this idea that people's distress is symptoms of dementia, that people say what they say and do what they do because their brain disease is making them do that, is a very narrow view that doesn't look deeper, doesn't look into deeper roots of distress besides just you have a symptom of dementia that we need to somehow manage or control. And this is a big problem with our traditional view of dementia because it leads us to use potentially not only ineffective, but dangerous medications when people become distressed instead of finding more successful and durable solutions. And in the last session of this series, I will explain a remarkable different way to understand people's distress, to understand people's words and actions using a well-being framework that we're going to go through. The myths and stereotypes obviously feed into this, but also language. Language can feed into stigma, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. The idea of homogenizing people, saying that we're doing memory care, once again feeds into stigmas. All people with dementia need to have this kind of care. Our engagement approaches often feed into stigmas. We often assume that people with this stage of dementia need these kinds of activities, which is kind of like saying everybody who got a B plus as a high school grade point average should all enjoy the same things and should all be good at certain things and not others. It's really a very limited view of how people engage and who they are as individuals. And unfortunately, the media and even our own advocacy campaigns tend to promote these same stigmas and self-fulfilling prophecies. So we have to police ourselves to a certain extent. Let me give you a few examples of this. Here's a guy named Steve who was on a peer support chat. Steve is living with a diagnosis of dementia. And he said, I have what I call my 10-minute rule. Whenever I meet someone, I always have a regular conversation. For the first 10 minutes, I want them to know me, see that I'm normal. And then I might tell them that I have Alzheimer's disease. If you did that right away, they'd immediately discount you. And that's what he's learned from his interactions with people. When he puts dementia up front in the conversation, he's discounted. Here's another one, a couple more quotes by people with dementia. If I say something, sometimes it gets pinned on Alzheimer's, whereas someone else in the family can say the same thing. Here's another one from one of the earliest authors living with Alzheimer's. I live with the imminent dread that one mistake in my daily life will mean another freedom will be taken from me. Think about maybe in your life, if you ever didn't pay a bill on time, if you ever left the teapot on too long in the stove and boiled away all the water, or if you ever had a minor fender bender car accident. I think we've all done these things in the past. But imagine once you have the label of dementia, that could be the end of your doing those things. People could judge you differently because you have that label and decide that they have to take that away from you for the rest of your life. It's a very powerful label, this stigma. Now, how about language? We have an expression in the Eden Alternative that words make worlds. I believe that language not only reflects our worldview, but it can actually set our worldview. It can make us think certain ways about certain people, about certain situations. So I'm going to list some language that I think tends to increase stigma, increase discrimination, increase stereotypes about dementia, negative stereotypes. And I want you to think about these words because we see them every day. The word demented really sounds to me like a psychopathic killer. Most people are very put off, offended by that language, and people with dementia do not want to be called demented. People with dementia also do not want to be called dementia sufferers. Now, we all suffer from time to time, and certainly it can be very difficult to live with dementia. But to label somebody a sufferer or a victim is to say that that's your only path in life. Once you have this label, you must suffer, you must be a victim, and that leads people to pity them, to take away from them, to try to just keep people comfortable, but not to challenge them to engage in life in any kind of a meaningful way. So people living with dementia do not like to be labeled this way, and we should avoid these words as much as possible. I like to say people living with dementia, people living with a diagnosis of dementia, that's putting the people first and not using negative labels like sufferers or victims. When we say Alzheimer's patients, once again, as a doctor, you might say that, but when we're saying it in a newspaper article or when someone's saying it in a daycare center, we're automatically labeling the person by virtue of their disease instead of saying these are people. We're people first. We're patients when we're being treated for medical conditions, but we're not being treated all day. We're just living our lives. We tend to use a lot of images like people are fading away. This is the long goodbye. The person's an empty shell, as if the person is disappearing, but the person is 100% there. Their ability to remember, their ability to speak, their ability to connect with the world the way they used to may be altered, but that person is 100% still there. And when you don't see a person, you stop treating that person like a human being. And we see that done in very obvious, abusive ways, but we also see it done in little subtle ways, like no need to invite mom to the family meeting. She won't understand what's going on. Or we won't ask her opinion, we'll just decide for her. We do this all the time when we don't see the person. Then we put people into categories. We give them labels to describe what might be normal activity. You can't walk anymore, you're now a wanderer. You can't stock up on something in case you run out, you're now a hoarder. You can't express your distress, you become a problem behavior. We talk about the burdens of dementia, which really puts a heavy feeling of guilt upon people to say that they are a burden to caregivers. And we use words that are very judgmental and label. People are agitated, they're aggressive, they're acting out. I'm sure there are many others you can think of, but we have to think about the weight of these labels and what they do to the person living with the diagnosis when we always see them this way, when we always describe them this way. And this happens from doctors, it happens in research articles, it happens in the newspaper, on television, it happens in movies, and it happens in daily conversation. As far as advocacy, think about these. Think about the war against dementia. Unfortunately, when we create a war and create an enemy of a disease that was not the person's fault, that person becomes a casualty of that war. Because when we stigmatize the disease and when we fight it, we actually are throwing the person under the bus in many ways. When we talk about aging and dementia as a tsunami, once again, we look at people as a burden, as a disaster, as a bother to our successful society. Same thing with calling Alzheimer's an epidemic. And by the way, it's not an infectious disease. I know there are theories that maybe some virus triggers some response in the body in some cases, but this is not an epidemic. This is just a consequence of an aging population. And we know that as we age, more and more people will develop diseases related to or caused by aging and living longer. And we know that Alzheimer's and most forms of dementia fit that. Even when we say we're looking for the first dementia survivor, I found that that offends many people who are living with a diagnosis. They may say, listen, I've had this horrible diagnosis. I've had to deal with grief. I've had to deal with the loss of my job, the loss of my driver's license, but I've become an advocate. I have connected myself to meaningful life. I have lived successfully for the past 8 years. And you're telling me I'm not a survivor because you couldn't make it go away? It's very offensive to people. We don't talk about the first diabetes survivor, even though it's incurable. Why do we do that with dementia? And once again, think about the other language choices. When we advocate, as Dementia Inclusive Durham, as Alzheimer's support organizations, we need to be careful that the words we use don't actually create more trouble for the people whom we are trying to support. So the key, and I know this isn't easy, believe me, I've had a lot of conversations with people from different organizations about this. The key is to try to make sure that society does understand that our cause is serious and that research funding and education and support are very, very important, but we have to do it without using language that reduces the dignity or the intrinsic value of the people we serve. This is so critically important, and we're not doing it terribly well. I think we have a ways to go. What are the best ways to combat stigma? Well, the first way is to engage whom I call the true experts in all endeavors. These are some of the great friends I've met over the years whom I consider true experts. And those are people who are actually living with a diagnosis of dementia of different types. These people are on different continents of the world. I've traveled, I've done presentations with them. We've had great conversations. We've shared dinners and drinks of wine. And I have learned so much from people because I can talk about dementia, but I don't truly know what it's like to have those changes going on in my brain. And I can wear goggles with Vaseline on them or plug my ears or get pushed around in the wheelchair. It helps a little bit, but that's not quite the same as living with dementia. So there's no better way to combat stigma than to engage people. And I believe that any conference, any educational endeavor should also include presentations from people living with the diagnosis, because they will tell you things that I can never tell you. Here's a quote from Christine Bryden, one of the early international advocates. She said, "We need to move away from labeling ourselves as a caregiver or a sufferer towards becoming a care partnership in which we accept, collaborate, and adapt to new roles within the journey of dementia. In this care partnership, the person with dementia is at the center of the relationship, not alone as an object to be looked at as merely a care recipient. Instead, we become an active partner in a circle of care." The other great way to combat stigma is to educate everyone, and the right kind of education, the kind that doesn't magnify these stigmas and myths and stereotypes. We need to educate healthcare providers, family members, medical professionals, and researchers. Believe it or not, they need education because they have this narrow, stigmatized view. Regulators from the government and the states. Media need to be educated. I'm constantly writing letters to newspaper articles about the language a reporter may have used. Advocacy organizations, lawyers, legislators, and community members, particularly for an initiative like Dementia Inclusive Durham. Other ways to support identity: understand who the person is today. It's important to know who the person has been, as Sam Fazio said in that quote I read, but we also need to know who the person is today. What is that person's intact strengths and abilities? What are their desires, their preferences? How are they viewing the world now? How can we understand their view of the world? Because it's not going to be what it was 20 years ago, any more than I view the world the way I did 20 years ago. We all have changes in our perspective. Understand that perspective. We need to support people's retained and emerging abilities. And there's a challenge for you. People not only retain some abilities, but they have emerging abilities too, as they unhook from certain parts of their lives and engage in other ways. My friend Mike Belville, who was on a previous slide, has been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia. 6.5 years ago, he was diagnosed. He took up watercolors, something he never did before he was diagnosed. He is quite a gifted watercolor artist. He never did art before, but this is something he did when he could no longer drive or do other things to occupy his time. He decided to try a new skill, and he has become quite good at it. So don't assume that people can't learn things, that people can't become better at things just because they have an incurable disease. We should follow people's individual rhythms as far as able. Understand what makes the person's rhythms work rather than our own. That means understanding when people have the most energy, when they have the most ability to focus, and when they're tired, when they need a break, instead of following other people's schedules, institutional schedules. How do we support that person's need to rest when they're able, to be active when they're able, to engage in ways that support their well-being? Understand the unique ways in which each person expresses themselves. How do I say certain things? What language do I use? What words do I choose? What expressions or what body language do I use if I can't find the words? What does it mean if I say something, if I do something? Could that be a clue to something that's going on, but I just have to express it a different way? Always use the person's preferred term of address. Don't assume that they want to be called a certain way or another way, and try to avoid those childlike or patronizing terms. Don't address people as if they're children, as if they're dumb. Speak to people as you would to any other adult. How about community planning for identity? Here's one thing that comes to mind when I think about dementia inclusive Durham and identity, and that is, how do people with dementia want to be identified? Do they want to know people around them to know that they have an invisible disability, which is the way many of us see dementia? It's a disability, but it's not always visible to the naked eye, like somebody in a wheelchair that might be visible. And if people want to be identified, how do they want to? These discussions should only take place when including a representation of people living with dementia. And there need to be a variety of options for people to select. So it's not just that everybody's going to be identified a certain way. We need to get opinions from those people who understand stigma, who understand how society treats them, who have some choice in how they share their disability with the world. Some examples might be a medical alert bracelet or some other wearable identifier. Some people may say nothing visible. Some people might just say, just educate the community so they recognize the clues, so that they can support us without making note of our disability. There are many different ways to think about this, but this may be a topic of discussion as you move forward with your dementia inclusive initiatives. So that's what I have to say about dementia. And the second one I want to talk to in this hour is the second domain of well-being, is the domain of connectedness. Connectedness is all about relationships, and that can be different levels. It can be relationships with family, with friends, your professional relationships. It could be civic or community engagement. It could be relationship with the arts or other hobbies or interests you have. My relationship with music, my relationship with a garden, my relationship with nature perhaps, or connections to the unseen, which can get into spirituality and religion and faith traditions as well. So there are many different kinds of connections we have in our lives that are important to us in different ways. Now, dementia, of course, challenges connectedness, and it can challenge it on a micro level or on a large scale level. Microscopically, a lot of it is your broken nerve connections that challenge connectedness. When you have the broken nerve connections that come with dementia, we have trouble getting to and bringing up memories. We may have trouble engaging in conversation because of difficulty finding the words, expressing ourselves, or difficulty understanding what the person is saying to us. We may have difficulty recognizing people, recognizing objects, recognizing situations, dates, events. We may have difficulty with wayfinding, finding our way, whether walking or driving or just navigating through our house from one room to another. And there are changes in the way the five senses come into our body, not only due to the aging process, but also due to the process of many types of dementia. On the larger scale, the macroscopic scale, we have challenges because of isolation and because society can tend to marginalize us. So partly this is due to our broken connections, because if we can't converse or remember, we will often self-isolate from activities, or we will have trouble preserving friendships and relationships, remembering people whom we have recently met. But it's partly because other people marginalize us. They become embarrassed or they have stigmas about us, and so they keep us away from engagements, from social activities, from other ways that we could stay engaged with our important relationships. A couple examples. Dr. Richard Taylor, the late Dr. Richard Taylor, a good friend of mine, once said, after I was diagnosed, my friends stopped coming around to see me. Finally, I called one of them and asked him, why don't you come to see me anymore? He said, Richard, I just didn't know what to say. I said to him, how about hello? Some of us are so uncomfortable with this idea of dementia because of our fears, because of the myths and misconceptions or the stigmas, that we don't know how to approach somebody. We don't know how to speak with them. And what Richard taught me was sometimes the best thing to do is to just walk up to somebody, sit down and say hello and see what happens. It doesn't have to be a scary thing. It doesn't have to be something you do or you accomplish. It's about that connectedness. And we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of conversation in a few moments. Here's a powerful story from Brian LeBlanc, who's been living with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Once, when he was walking in the mall with his wife, he ran into a friend. His friend greeted them and he said to Brian, "How are you?" And Brian said, "I'm doing well, thanks." And then the friend immediately turned to Brian's wife and said, "How is he doing?" So what Brian said was ignored. It wasn't even taken as a truthful response. He had to immediately check in with the person without the quote label to find out if that was a true answer or not. Well, who has a better idea of how somebody's doing than themselves, whether they have dementia or not? How can we improve connectedness? There are many ways. We can do it through our interpersonal relationships. We can do it through operations, the way that professionals care for people and the way we as family members support people in a living environment. And we can improve connectedness through building design, community design, and structure as well. So here are some examples of improving connectedness. Let's talk about communication. To me, I think this is the most important thing we have to remember. At its most basic level, good communication is empowering people living with dementia. If we take the time to communicate well, to make sure that we are understood and to make sure we understand the person, then we are empowering them to be understood and to understand us and to continue to advocate for what they need, what they choose, and what they feel. If we don't take the time to do that, then we have disempowered people. We have taken something very important away from them. So communication is key. And if there's nothing to remember from all 5 parts of this talk, let's talk about communication, because this is, in my mind, the most important thing for any person in any situation, no matter what your relationship is with that person. First steps: reestablish the relationship. Don't assume a person remembers you. I mean, maybe it's a family member and you know that they do, but if you're caring for someone, if you're a home care aide, if you're somebody from the community, don't put the person on the spot. Don't say, "Remember me." Just say, "Hi, it's Al. I'm your healthcare aide. I'm just stopping by to see you. Okay, if I come in and visit with you." Reestablish that relationship. Let the person know what your connection is. And then optimize comfort, hearing, and vision. Sometimes we'll walk up to somebody who's sitting somewhere, maybe their glasses aren't on, their hearing aids aren't in, maybe the TV is going, and we just start a conversation because we don't want to interrupt what they're doing. But if you really want people to connect with you, you have to optimize those things. So don't be afraid to say, "Can I visit with you?" And if they say yes, "Can I turn down the television, or can I turn the TV off a bit so I can hear you well?" Let's check your hearing aids and make sure that they're turned up okay. Let's make sure your glasses are clean and make sure that you're wearing them if you need to see me and need to understand what I'm saying and what I'm communicating. I always believe that we should try to sit down in every interaction with a person with dementia. And I think there are 3 reasons to sit down. The first reason is it facilitates good communication. If you are right in front of the person face to face, then the person can see you, they can hear you better. They can see your lips move. They can see your facial expressions. It just helps you to be understood. Not only your body, not only your words, but your body language and your expressions as well. A second reason to sit down is that there's kind of a hierarchy, and that is whenever you stand over somebody, there's this feeling of who's in charge, who's in control. And no matter who you are, whether you're a professional or a family member, no matter how nice you are, when you stand over somebody, it's like you're dominating the situation. You are controlling the encounter. And that can feel very off-putting. If people have trouble expressing themselves, it may intimidate them to the point where they have trouble expressing themselves. If people already are feeling angry or suspicious about being controlled or feeling like they're not being heard, then that will tend to push things in the wrong direction and make people feel more controlled. And sometimes you can actually bring out an angry response if you stand over people. It's good to get down to eye level, even get down a little bit below eye level, put the person in a slightly superior position so that they know that they are very much at least an equal, if not in control of the encounter. The third reason to sit down is there's another very important unspoken message, and that is when you sit in a chair, what your body language is saying is, "I have time for you." When you stand up, you could rush out of the room at any second. For a person who has trouble, needs time organizing their thoughts, finding the right words, that kind of body language can be enough to intimidate them, to make them just shut down or to give up. But when you sit down and relax and have body language that shows that you are present, that you are attentive to them, that often is enabling for the person, helps them find words that they might not find otherwise. So that leads into another important thing, and that is presence. We should also always approach a person with a sense of mindfulness, a sense of presence. We tend to multitask in life. That doesn't work with dementia. What we need to do to make sure that person understands us and can be understood and can express themselves as well as possible is to put everything else out of our minds. Forget about where we just were or what we have to do next, but just sit down and focus and have that body language and that attentiveness that says, right now, I am here 100% to communicate with you and to hear what you have to share and to listen and to help in any way I can. That can be extremely empowering. And just these little mindsets can actually get people to speak that other people thought couldn't talk. It's a very powerful way to approach people. Body language is also very important, and some very important research was done on this about 40 or 50 years ago by Armin Mehrabian. And he wrote a book in which he said that when we have a conversation, I'm not talking about a mathematics lecture, but a conversation between people where there's some emotional content and some meaning behind the words, that only 7% of the meaning in what we're saying comes from the actual words we use. Only 7%. Another 38%, he said, was due to what he called paralinguistic influences, our tone of voice, our pauses, the way we modulate our voice. Let me give you an example of that. I could say, boy, there's nothing I'd rather be doing on this Monday afternoon than sharing this information with everybody out there at Dementia Inclusive Durham. Now I'll try to say exactly the same words in a different way. Nothing I'd rather be doing on a Monday afternoon than sitting here and sharing this information with the folks at Dementia Inclusive Durham. So the tone of voice, the eye roll, the pauses are totally different. Same words, but a different message about whether I'm enjoying what I'm doing or not. But even that only adds up to less than half. Mehrabian said that over half of the message in our words comes from the nonverbal, the body language, our body movements, our facial expressions, the way we move our arms, the way we engage the person. That's very powerful because that says that we can't just think about the words we say. We have to think about how we are expressing them, how we're saying them, and what our whole body is doing while we're communicating with people. And that's very important because if you've had a bad day, if you've just had a heated conversation with somebody else and you carry that into the room with you, that can be very powerful because the person may read that as being something that's aimed at them. Why doesn't she like me? What is she upset with me for? What did I do? Is this person going to hurt me? So sometimes we say the right words and we don't understand why the person didn't respond the right way. Here are a couple of pictures I took off the internet. Now, these could be very nice people. Who knows what happened to these people right before these pictures were taken? But if they then have to come up to a person with dementia and support them, provide some kind of care or support, and they're carrying those facial expressions with them, imagine how they might be interpreted by the person that they're approaching. Imagine how you or I, a person without dementia, might interpret those facial expressions. I think we can laugh when we see these and say, whoa, don't want that person taking my clothes off and giving me a bath. It's not anything about who the person is, but at that moment, they don't look like somebody we want to engage with. And so, once again, think about the connection between our words and our nonverbal expression. And this takes us back to the first part where I talked about language choices. If we use those negative labeling words in our conversation, they give us a mindset. If we think somebody is a problem behavior, if we think they're aggressive, if we think that they somehow are the problem, are acting out, we're going to approach them with a certain kind of mindset. And that mindset may find its way into our body language. So that when we talk to them in a nice way, we may be expressing that distaste, that displeasure, that disapproval in ways that we don't even realize. And once again, the encounter can get worse instead of better when we do that. As far as speaking, it's important to speak slowly and clearly. Some people say you should try to mirror the pace at which the person speaks to you. Never talk down or patronize people, and don't address them like children. Be genuine. Remember that people who have age-related hearing loss need to have the consonants enunciated. Consonants all those T's and P's and S's and D's, those are high pitched, and those are the pitches we lose with age-related hearing loss. The vowels, I, they're easier to hear. So if we don't enunciate the consonants, it can just sound like that. You can't hear the beginnings and ends of words. So you don't need to shout at people who are hard of hearing. That can even be painful with age-related hearing loss. Just take time to speak maybe a bit more slowly and to enunciate those higher pitched parts of the words. Otherwise, speak as you would to any other person. Remember that half the conversation is our ability to listen. Be mindful, be present, focus on the person. Give an open, accepting presence. Think about our body language, but also look at the person's expression beyond their words. Remember, maybe only 7% or even less of what they're saying is in their words. Look at their facial expressions, listen to their tone of voice, look at their body language. And when you're having trouble understanding, start by validating feelings. Many people who have more trouble accessing memories are living in a world that's more dominated by the way they feel than what they remember, the facts around them. So what people express may be overridden by an emotion, sadness, anger, frustration, anxiety. So start by naming that. Boy, you seem really sad today. I'm sorry. It's really hard to have a day like that, isn't it? Stop and validate and spend time naming what you hear in emotional expressions and connect with the person there, because often they cannot hear the words you're going to say until you connect at that emotional level. And watch for embodied expressions of choice. In other words, people can express preferences by saying, I want that or I don't, but they may not have the words. They may do it through their actions. They may push some food away. They may push you away. They may hold their hand up. So remember that these are also preferences, and make that part of your listening when you observe the person and how they respond to what you say or what you ask or what you do. A couple other communication tips: give people time to speak. It may take longer for them to process your words and to come up with a response. You don't want to cut them off, but you might help fill in ideas, or you might rephrase a question to help people get unstuck. Say the question a different way because maybe they didn't quite get it. Or you can speak to the underlying feelings of what they say. When you don't understand what they say, you say, boy, it sounds like that was really difficult. It sounds like that was upsetting. See if you can get them to then express themselves further. Another technique I talk about, which I found very helpful, is what I call speaking like a sports interview. And since we're in Durham, I got Coach K there, and he's being interviewed. And I thought it was always funny. The sports interviewers often don't ask questions. They'll just make statements. So maybe, Tracy's interviewing Coach K, and she says, well, Coach K, you had quite a rally there in the third quarter, but your team came up just a little bit short at the end. And then she holds the microphone out. And I always thought, well, that's kind of funny. She sticks the microphone in his face, but she didn't ask him anything. But sports personalities know how to respond to that. They're just being given an entry to talk about that event in the way they want. And I found that with a person who's forgetful, that's a great way to talk to people. Instead of asking questions, make a statement. Instead of saying, what did you have for lunch today? Say, I hear that they had lasagna for lunch today. That must have been delicious. And then the person doesn't have to be right or wrong, because if you ask a question, the person has to answer and they have to bring up information, which could be right or wrong. That can be embarrassing, that can be frustrating, and it can make a person stop speaking. But if you just say something, then they can answer any way they want. They can say, yes, the lasagna was delicious. They can say, I didn't have lasagna, I had a peanut butter sandwich. They can say, I like lasagna. They can say, we made sauce at my house every Sunday. The person doesn't have to be right or wrong. And I find that this really actually enables people to converse more freely when we just talk in statements instead of in questions. And so there's a little exercise that you can do for practice on your own. Think of the kinds of questions you might ask somebody with dementia, and think if there are ways that you can say them as statements, or say something about them, rather than asking the person. So instead of where did you live, you could say, tell me about your house. You could say, you must have some fond memories of your house. Let the person come up with their own answers. They set the level of detail. They don't have to be right or wrong. And then when you get some conversation flowing, if you want to ask a question, try to make it a question about an opinion. So instead of saying, where did you live? You can say, what did you like about your house? What did you like best about your house? That way, the person's opinion is always right, because I can't tell you what you like best about your house. So once again, you're giving the person the freedom to say something that's not going to be wrong. And when you ask these kinds of questions, it's easier and much more successful than asking for facts. Another part of listening is, once again, being non-judgmental. And remember that when people are focused on emotions, their language may be more symbolic or more based on the feeling than the fact. So rather than arguing the facts or trying to correct people, validate and speak to the underlying feeling. And avoid these 4 traps. These are often taught to people, but I don't think they're particularly helpful. Those 4 traps are reorienting people, redirecting people, distracting people, or deceiving people. These are really things that are based on our needs, our need to get back to whatever task we're doing, our need to just get the person off our back and distract them for a while so that they will stop asking us or coming to us with their need. But there's an underlying need there. No matter how you do that, no matter how it might seem to work for the moment, there's a need that you didn't address. And that's often in those well-being domains. The person may not have felt like they're being heard or like their needs being satisfied. If you try to distract them, if you try to talk about the latest football game or redirect them or reorient them and try to tell them that they're not right, if you try to tell them a little white lie, you're never fulfilling that unmet need. And so it's going to come back again and again and again. So you may think that you're making life easier for yourself when you do these things, but you're just kicking the can down the road. It's going to come back again and again. When you speak to the deeper needs, as we'll talk about in the last part, you will find that you can actually not only answer for the moment, but you can help make these repetitive needs go away because we've actually gone beyond just trying to solve things for the moment. And if you forget everything else in this entire course and just do those communication tips on the last several slides with every encounter, you will see a huge difference in how you and the person you're supporting succeed in life with each other. A bigger difference than you will see with anything else. Some other ways to support connectedness. Once again, thinking about dementia inclusive Durham. First of all, consistent staffing. So if someone's living in long-term care, a nursing home, if they're living in assisted living, but even if they are getting home-based services, consistent staffing is very important. Don't send strangers around to care for people, especially when it comes to personal care, like taking people's clothes off, bathing them, examining them. They should be people you know and trust and feel familiar with. We'll talk about that more in the next section when we talk about security. But consistency is important, particularly when people are challenged, have trouble remembering names and faces. Always seek to include people in meetings, gatherings, and conversations. Don't lock people out. Always make sure people are there so that they understand that they're part of the conversation, that they are connected. The idea of being, we don't always have to do things with people. It doesn't always have to be an activity. Sometimes the best way to connect is just to be with somebody, to share a cup of coffee or tea, to sit and watch something together, some music, or look out the window or sit on the porch and watch the sunset and just be together. Civic engagement can be important. People can continue to engage as people are able. I met a couple once in Iowa, and the woman was part of the local Alzheimer's Association's board. And she would bring her husband to the meetings. She would bring him to the educational events. He was living with dementia, but she wanted him to be included. It was all about supporting him anyway, so why shouldn't he be part of that? There are many peer support groups, and a couple I'll mention are the Dementia Action Alliance, and their website is daanow.org, or the Dementia Alliance International, which is dementiaallianceinternational.org. These are support groups created by people living with dementia for people living with dementia. And there's nobody who understands you better, who can support you better than your peers. And I always recommend that people be connected, not only with the community, but with people who share their diagnosis, who can help share the little tricks of the trade that they've learned to help them live better. Connecting with nature, connecting with exercise, connecting with spirituality. These are all important to the well-being of people, and we should support people to do this in any way they can. Music can be so important. And if you've never seen the documentary Alive Inside, look it up. You can see it on streaming media. It's a very powerful documentary about how even people with very severe dementia connect through very important personalized music that meant something to them throughout their lives, connecting with the arts. There are groups that take people with dementia to the museum or to concerts or to plays or dance recitals so that people can continue to engage in things that are important to them. As far as community planning for connectedness, well, there's also the physical designs. We need to talk about, is Durham walkable? Are the communities, the neighborhoods of Durham, are they walkable? Do they have adequate lighting? Is the footing good? Are the sidewalks good? Do they have footing that accepts assistive devices for people that might need a walker or a cane or a wheelchair? Are there wayfinding cues to orientation, helping people know where they are, where they need to go? Are the buildings that people may access, libraries, banks, other community buildings, are they dementia inclusive? Are they accessible? Do the staff of those buildings understand dementia? Have they been educated in ways like this about how to understand and how to engage people? Have we paid attention to the signage? Is the lettering large enough? Is it easy to read? Does it make sense to people? Are there pictures as well as words for people who may have trouble with the words? How do we transport people? Can people get to the community if they can't drive anymore? Do we have good public transportation, and have we educated the people that provide transportation as well? Are we providing ADA style accommodations for reading, listening, etc.? Because often older people have those same disabilities of other people. And do we have opportunities for intergenerational connections? And are we using technology in the best way to enable people to remain connected to their communities, either from home or when they're out and about? So these are some of the conversations that the Durham community should be having as we move forward to help support the domain of connectedness for people with dementia in your community. So thank you very much, and I hope you will engage with questions. I appreciate your attention. And the next session, we will talk about 2 more domains of well-being.